Good morning. I rise to welcome you to the 2022 Warren Dennis Lecture here at New Brunswick Theological Seminary. I am Micah L. McCreary, president of the seminary. As president of New Brunswick Theological Seminary, I stand on the shoulder of giants who established this amazing ministry. I stand side by side with great women and men of faith who continue this ministry. And I stand to cultivate the gifts of exceptional students who will elevate this ministry. As a scholar, administrator, practitioner, I engage in a Sankofa of each institution I serve. Sankofa is a deep time understanding. It is to simultaneously focus on the past, present, and future. This is where I first met the Reverend Dr. Warren Dennis. After that Sankofa encounter, my spouse and I took a McCreary Mecca to North Carolina and sat with Dr. D and Gloria over a meal. We entered into conversations about him and his ministry at New Brunswick Theological Seminary. I learned firsthand of his ministry of radical reclamation, calling New Brunswick Theological Seminary to critical reflection. I learned firsthand of his ministry of systemic rectification, challenging as a court prophet would challenge the king for us to act justly. I learned firsthand of his ministry of presence, sitting on benches and the grass around the seminary, teaching students and working with colleagues, leading faithfully. We thank you, Reverend Dennis, for your gifts of ministry, of dealing with the realities of our society, not running from those realities. Let us pray. Great Redeemer, Creator, Empowerer, Facilitator of every good and perfect gift, we assemble this day to celebrate the legacy of a great man, to continue the work of a great institution, and to hear from awesome, dynamic scholars who have thought deeply about these things. Bless, anoint, inspire, that we might be better. We honor you with this program as we honor you with our lives. In the name of the Christ we pray. Amen.
Good morning. It is an honor to be here, and I'm going to take this moment to introduce the speakers. Our first presenter will be Dr. Joseph Graves, who is a professor of biological sciences at North Carolina A&T State University. His research in evolutionary genomics of adaptation shapes our understanding of biological aging and bacterial responses to nanomaterials. His recent book on the biology of race with Alan Goodman is titled Racism, Not Race, Answers to Frequently Answered Questions. It was named by Curbis Reviews as one of the best nonfiction books of 2021. And filmmaker Ken Burns has this to say about the book, quote, "What a timely and thoughtful book, posing in Socratic fashion the central questions of our struggling republic," end quote. For all of the NBTS students, he is a familiar face, since he has been a guest in several of the classes sponsored by the Science for Seminarians grant. Our second two presenters are, first, Desmond Drummer, managing editor for Equitable Economics, leads Policy Link's work to redefine our economy to work for all, especially the more than 100 million people who are shut out of the country's prosperity. A proven strategist and innovator with a track record of developing solutions, building teams, and delivering results. His leadership in policy development, program design, technology, and innovation has been recognized by the Obama White House, Code for America, and the Aspen Institute. Most recently, he was the co-founder and executive director of New Consensus. There he worked to develop and promote the Green New Deal, a transformative vision that shifted the U.S. public discourse on climate action. Prior to New Consensus, he distinguished himself as a civic innovator on the south side of Chicago, with a body of work that spans youth leadership development, land use planning, and community technology. And joining him is Dr. Darrick Hamilton, the Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy, and the founding director of the Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy at the New School. Professor Hamilton examines social stratification and the political economy in order to move policy and practice in fundamentally new directions that promote economic inclusion, social equity, and civic engagement. Considered one of the nation's foremost public intellectuals, he has been profiled in the New York Times, Mother Jones, and Wall Street Journal. Professor Hamilton has been involved in crafting policy proposals that have garnered media attention and inspired legislative proposals at the federal, state, and local levels, including baby bonds, guaranteed income, and a federal job guarantee. In 2020, he served as a member of the Economic Committee of the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force. He has testified before several Senate and House committees, including the Joint Economic Committee and the Senate Banking Committee. Appointed by the mayor, he is currently serving as a commissioner on the New York City Racial Justice Charter Revision Commission. And last but not least is Gihane Jérémie-Brink. She's a professor in the graduate program in clinical psychology with the Department of Psychology at William Patterson University. She studies the psychological well-being of Black emerging adults, women, and couples with families. Her research on these topics explore racial and ethnic socialization, coping strategies, and critical consciousness as protective factors. Dr. Jérémie-Brink is also the co-principal investigator and director of the WELL program at New Brunswick Theological Seminary, a 5-year grant program that promotes mental, physical, and spiritual well-being of Black and Latino pastors and community leaders. She was a clinical scholar postdoc fellow at the Family Institute of Northwestern University. She received her Doctor of Philosophy in counseling, psychology, and a Master of Arts in Community Counseling from Loyola University, Chicago. This morning, we are honored, and I and Dean are certainly honored, to have this esteemed panel with us, and we thank AAAS and the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion for the Science and Seminaries grant that makes this event possible. Let's talk about the procedure for today. Each speaker will speak for about 40 minutes, and there will be time for questions from the audience. Please enter your questions into the Zoom chat feature, and we will give them, as many of them as possible, to our presenters. After the speakers have finished, Dr. McLean-Farrell will offer some comments about the day and provide some thoughts going forward. Our first presenter was at dinner last night with us when he had a family emergency, and he needed to fly home this morning. Last night, very late in his hotel room, he recorded his lecture. We are going to run it now, and we are going to ask that we apologize for any of the technical glitches that happened, but he wanted to make sure that he could present his lecture with us today, and we look forward to it. Because he is not present and on his way home, there won't be any questions after his lecture. Thank you very much.
The first, but not last, great plague of the 21st century. I am Dr. Joseph L. Graves, Jr., Professor of Biological Sciences in the Department of Biology at North Carolina A&T State University. I give my apologies for not delivering this lecture in person, but I had to respond to a family emergency, medical emergency. For those of you that don't know my work, my research focuses on the evolutionary genomics of adaptation and how it shapes our understanding of biological aging, as well as microbial responses to nanomaterials. I'm the author of these recent books, Antimicrobial Nanomaterials, Principles and Applications, published by Elsevier in the fall of 2021, as well as Graves and Goodman, Alan Goodman, Racism Not Race, Answers to Frequently Asked Questions, which was published by Columbia University Press in December of 2021. That book is worked based upon my earlier work on this question, The Emperor's New Clothes, Biological Theories of Race at the Millennium, published by Rutgers in 2005, as well as Race Myth, Why We Pretend Race Exists in America, published by Dutton in 2005. So when the Lamb opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. They were given power over a fourth of the earth to kill by a sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. Revelation 6, 7, 8. Now, the painting or the drawing you see is from the painter Julius Schnorr von Carlsfeld in 1860. And John of Patmos, the writer of Revelation, here is talking about something that was actually quite a consistent theme for the humans of the ancient world. Now, this figure shows a timeline of human population growth. Our species, anatomically modern humans, evolved in Africa around 300,000 years ago. But the first 280,000 of those years, we were hunter-gatherers with small and dispersed populations. It took over 200,000 years of human history to get to 1 billion people, and just 200 years to reach over 7 billion people. Now, the reason for this is that the vast majority of our existence was spent as hunter-gatherers. And in fact, in that first 200,000 years, the only anatomically modern humans were living in Africa. And only after the ice sheets of the last ice age began to recede did ways out of Africa open up and people began to migrate across the globe. Now, the invention of stable agriculture occurred around 20,000 years ago in different centers around the globe. But this created the conditions that accelerated the evolution of pathogens that could infect humans. And in particular, increasing population density, habitat alteration, the domestication of animals, travel and trade between geographical areas increased, wars which disrupted, cultural, social norms of people, and also slavery, which brought together large groups of people in conditions of manifest social inequality, which also precipitated the spread of an epidemic disease. So, with the growth of agriculture and the growth of human civilizations, people had to try to explain why pestilence seemed always with them. And initially, people had special creation, either by God, a single God, or by the gods, as a way to try to understand the difficulty that humans face with regard to this ongoing onslaught of plague that occurred in their communities. Now, they also had to deal with the idea, particularly with regard to Christianity, the idea that a beneficent God shouldn't be, striking human beings with all these, painful, difficult diseases leading to the death of people they love. So the explanation began to be centered around the notion that disease and death were the result of some kind of divine plague. And this is also an argument used by many special creationists today, and I give you a link here for those who are interested in exploring that further. Now, in England, in the first part of the 19th century, the Bridgewater treatises attempted to explain the beneficence and omnipotence of God by looking at examples in nature. One of the things that's apparent about these essays is that they failed to address the existence of things like yellow fever, malaria, typhus, and bubonic plague, and a host of other diseases that had ended the lives of untold millions of people in great pain and agony. To understand why that happens, we really have to look at the structure of life on this planet. This diagram shows a tree of relatedness of all living things, and all of the organisms shaded in purple represent bacteria. These are single-celled organisms. When we go to the pinkish shade, most of the organisms described there are single-celled. Okay, fungi and animals have multicellular representatives, but en masse, the vast majority of organisms within that group or branch of the tree are single-celled. That is similarly true of plants, although plants don't tend to be parasitic on human beings. Now, this diagram is a simplified form of the last diagram. And here we see the great tree of life broken into three major domains: the bacteria, which are all single-celled, the archaea, who are all single-celled. Then when we go to the eukarya, which include some multicellular organisms like animals, fungi, and plants, but the vast majority of these groups are also single-celled, such as the ciliates, which cause disease in humans, the flagellates. Okay, one example of those is African sleeping sickness, microsporidia, which includes the organism that causes malaria, and entamoeba, which causes a variety of diseases, including some of the most dangerous dysentery that a person can ever get. Now, bacteria are the most abundant cellular living things on this planet, and they're estimated to comprise at least 5 times 10 to the 30 of cells. Now, to give you a sense of how big that number is, there are only about 1 times 10 to the 24 stars in the known universe. So the number of bacterial cells on this planet is at least 1 million times greater than the number of stars in the known universe. There are also approximately 1 billion species of bacteria. Now, I also want to point out that bacteria aren't all bad. In fact, many of them play key roles as symbiotic organisms, and also they run the global elemental cycles, such as the cycling of nitrogen through the biosphere. Without the bacteria that allow that, life on this planet couldn't go. So the three great domains of life are differentiated by their cell structure. Now, the problem, however, is that there is another form of life, non-cellular life, what we call viruses. Now, these non-cellular organisms, by necessity, must infect cellular organisms to be able to complete their life cycle. Now, non-cellular viruses are largely classified by their type of genetic code and the organisms that they infect. For example, while the T4 bacteriophage typically infects bacteria, it's also capable of infecting animals such as insects, starfish, and chordates like ourselves. The virus influenza H1N1 strain was the cause of the great 1917 to 1924 influenza pandemic, which killed greater than 100 million people around the world. Now, the tobacco mosaic virus has a rod shape, makes only 6 proteins, but it infects plants like tobacco, which is also a member of the same family as tomatoes, the Solanaceae. Pandovirus is one of the greatest or biggest viruses that's ever been discovered. It has over 2,500 proteins, so it's very similar to bacteria, and they routinely infect amoebas. Now, this is a picture of a diagram of an enveloped virus like SARS-CoV-2. It has an interior proteinaceous capsule, and it has proteins sticking out from the capsule, which allow it to infect the cells that it targets. There's a lipid layer around the proteins, which adds greater protection for the interior genetic code. Now, this is a diagram of the HIV virus. And again, this shows that this virus must infect a human cell to be able to replicate. Now, HIV is unique in that it uses a special form of reverse transcribing protein. And this allows it to go from its RNA strand to a DNA strand to an RNA strand to making a protein. Typically, in cellular life, you can only go DNA makes RNA, which makes protein. But HIV first uses its RNA, then makes a DNA, an RNA, and a protein to put together the pieces needed to reassemble its virus, and then it can go on to infect other white blood cells. Now, an infected cell, white blood cell, can literally make millions of HIV viral particles per day, and that, if it continues without treatment, will lead to the condition known as acquired immune deficiency syndrome, also called AIDS. Now, the HIV epidemic was tragic, but it focused more than any other place on Africa. Now, this is in part because the HIV virus first crossed over into the human species in Africa in the 1930s, but it really didn't take off as an epidemic across the continent until the coming of the apartheid labor system in South Africa. Here, men were separated from their families for a long period of time, frequented prostitutes who saw hundreds of men and would be infected with HIV, infecting other men who would then go back to their families and infect their wives and create a vicious feedback cycle, allowing the HIV virus to spread across the entire continent due to the migrant labor system. In all the other areas of the world, okay, most of the transmission of HIV occurred from men having sex with men, but in Africa, it was men having sex with women. Now, we are here today to discuss the coronavirus. Now, this is a single-stranded RNA virus that can cause respiratory infections from mild to fatal in mammals. Now, the first SARS-CoV outbreak in 2002 to 2003 spread to 29 countries, but only 9,000 cases and 800 deaths were recorded. Another coronavirus called Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, or MERS, was first reported in Saudi Arabia in 2012. And again, this was also a zoonotic virus, meaning it originated first in other animals and then evolved the capacity to infect humans. And again, only about 3,000 cases were ever reported. Now, MERS hasn't gone away, it's still there, and certainly has the potential to come back. Sometime in December of 2019, SARS-CoV-2 entered humans in the Hubei province of China. Now, the World Health Organization country office reported a cluster of cases, which they called a novel viral pneumonia. Less than 2 weeks later, the draft genome sequence of this virus was published to GenBank. The picture below shows a rendition of what SARS-CoV-2 looks like as an encapsulated virus, and it particularly focuses on the spike protein coming off of the surface of the capsule. And these spike proteins are what the virus uses to make its way into our cells. Now, here's a timeline that shows how the SARS-CoV-2 epidemic unfolded. In January of 2020, the first draft genome of SARS-CoV-2 was published. WHO declared SARS-CoV-2 an outbreak as a public health emergency of international concern. Later on that month, we see evidence of the first person-to-person transmission. Both asymptomatic and symptomatic individuals could transmit SARS-CoV-2. We also saw the first transmission of SARS-CoV-2 in the United States. Now, in February, it was shown that the receptor for SARS-CoV-2 was the angiotensin converting enzyme protein on the surface of cells in respiratory tissue. Now, in March of that year, the Coastal Lumina cruise ship super spreader event occurred, which spread SARS-CoV over the entire United States. Now, this resulted from people contracting SARS-CoV-2 on a cruise in the Mediterranean. When the cruise was canceled, the cruise ship line arranged a charter flight for these individuals to come back to the United States, ironically to Atlanta, which is the center of, or is the location of the Centers of Disease Control. Now, the problem here, and why this became a super spreader event, is that the CDC in Atlanta, while they were given ample warning that these individuals would be coming back to the United States and that some of them had already contracted SARS-CoV-2 and were symptomatic, had no plan to deal with bringing these people back into the United States. Now, you might think that this resulted only because of the fact that the SARS-CoV epidemic was new. But the United States CDC had already dealt with scenarios, theoretical scenarios like this one, that they would use to put in action to prevent just this kind of thing from occurring. And so this was still while Donald Trump was president of the United States. He was still downplaying the significance of the SARS-CoV virus. And here was an opportunity where if the president of the United States had stepped in and given clear directions to the CDC, this super spreader event could have been stopped. Instead, the CDC in Atlanta allowed these individuals to be processed in the same way as any person coming back into the United States. They were checked for their temperature and allowed to fly across the United States, of course, infecting other people on airplanes, infecting people when they got to their hometowns, and so on. Now, later that month, WHO declared COVID 2019 as a pandemic. Now, at this time, I had begun to warn that COVID-19 would differentially kill Black and brown people, and that this virus, if unchecked, would evolve new and more dangerous variants. Also in March, first clinical trials of COVID-19 vaccine began, both in a cooperation between the National Institutes of Health and Moderna. Neurological symptoms of COVID-19 were first identified in Milan, Italy. SARS-CoV-2 was also shown to replicate in several species of domesticated and laboratory animals. Now, the danger here, of course, is that this showed that the virus was continuing to evolve its transmission capacity. And if it infects dogs and cats, they become a reservoir for which the virus can easily, once again, come back to infect humans as the virus has changed. In May, Pfizer and BioNTech announced the start of their phase 1, phase 2 trials for an mRNA vaccine. In that same month, COVID-19 associated multi-system inflammatory disease in children was reported in the UK, Italy, Spain, and the US. And what this means is that not only could SARS-CoV-19 infect children, but that it could lead to unanticipated disease in addition to that produced by the virus. In June of that month, Regeneron Pharmaceuticals showed that its multiclonal antibody therapy ironically could drive the evolution of new variants that could escape vaccines. Now, they showed that you could avoid this by using antibody cocktails, but of course, this was an alarming development. Later on, in June, July, it was demonstrated that the antibody response to SARS-CoV-2 only lasted for several months, which then was further confirmed by the first case of reinfection in Hong Kong, meaning that an individual that had either been vaccinated or themselves had had COVID 2019 was then reinfected by that virus later on as their immunity waned and the virus had evolved. In September, Donald Trump at the White House held another super spreader event. The pictures of this are available for anyone to see. There are hundreds of people there, not social distancing, not wearing masks. And some of them got sick with SARS-CoV-2, infected others, and they went on to infect others. In November that month, Pfizer and BioNTech announced that their vaccine efficacy was 90%. Later that month, Moderna announced that their vaccine efficacy was greater than 94%. Now, these are very high numbers for vaccines. And this really resulted from the fact that new technology was used to produce these vaccines, okay, that was superior than the old method of using weakened viruses to initiate an immune response. Now, at the same time that the good news of the vaccines was being released, there was growing concern over the emergence of viral variants that had both increased infectivity, such as Delta, but also increased capacity to make people sick. Now, in August of 2020, I wrote a piece for Science for the People magazine entitled "Their Money, Our Lives." And in it, I wanted to make the point that particularly early on in the pandemic, the people most likely to suffer the greatest mortality and illness from it were Black and brown people. And that's simply because the history of epidemic and disease in the United States has shown this pattern repeatedly. So I also wanted to point out that in this early phase of the pandemic, the differential infection of Black and brown people was not due to genetics. This was a zoonotic infection, meaning that it began in non-human species And so therefore, no human population had greater genetically determined resistance compared to any other. Early on in the pandemic, I wrote an article for Science for the People magazine called Their Money, Our Lives. This was an attempt to demonstrate that Black and brown people were more likely to be the victims of the pandemic simply because previous epidemics in the United States had shown that Black and brown bodies were often the ones most likely to suffer. Now, I also wanted to make the point that this did not result from genetics. This was a result of zoonosis, meaning that the infection had occurred or started in a species other than humans. And so no group of human beings had greater genetically determined resistance compared to any other. Now, an early study found that severe COVID risk was actually associated with a gene cluster on chromosome 3 that had been inherited from Neanderthals at a frequency of 50% in South Asians and 16% in Europeans. Now, when our species, modern humans, left Africa, it came in contact with the archaic human species Neanderthals that were living in Eurasia, and hybridization occurred, meaning humans and Neanderthals mated with each other, and those genes were carried forward as humans began to expand around the world. A later study showed that a protective region was actually associated with Neanderthal ancestry, and this was found on chromosome 12. And this reduced the probability of a person requiring intensive care, and this was found at a frequency of 25 to 30 throughout Eurasia. Now, I want to make the point that persons of African descent also have a portion of their genome which originated in Neanderthals due to the genetic admixture with Europeans. Now, this occurred during chattel slavery when enslaved women were forced to have children by their European masters. Now, the average African American is somewhere between 24 to 16% European ancestry, which means some of that ancestry came from the extinct archaic species, the Neanderthals. Now, so if genetics wasn't explaining the greater vulnerability of Black and brown people, this had to result from the fact that where these groups lived and worked were the primary risk factors for infection early in the pandemic. Now, Black and brown segregation in high density, low environmental quality neighborhoods had been driven by racialized economic policies, including discriminatory lending, insurance, and real estate policies. Individuals who could not stay home from work or could not social distance while they were at work, and for example, in the meatpacking industry, were extremely vulnerable. Now, efforts to address the vulnerability of racial ethnic minorities, incarcerated persons, and nursing home residents should have been acted on very early on in the start of this crisis, but in fact, they were not. Now, this slide shows how, when the Delta variant began to circulate in California, it rapidly began to become the most predominant variant. And this happened across the nation later when the Omicron variant came along. It was the most evolved variant so far, showing enhanced transmissibility and also partial resistance to COVID vaccines. Now, the only good story with Omicron is that it tended to be less virulent. However, by 12/15/21, it was identified in 80 countries, and later on in that month, it accounted for 73% of all new infections. Now, this was occurring at a time when political orientation was now beginning to take over as a determinant of an individual's COVID risk. earlier, December 2020, 27% of Americans were shown to be vaccine hesitant. Within this group, the following percentages were shown. Republicans, 42%. Those aged 30 to 49, 36%. Rural residents, 35%. And adult Blacks, 35%. Now, the reason that vaccine hesitant people gave was, one, there could be potential side effects. Two, they distrusted the government. Three, the vaccines were too new. Four, politics of vaccine development process made them uneasy, and that was 53%. Specifically among the Blacks, 47% said they just didn't trust vaccines in general, and another 50% thought that you could get COVID from the vaccines. Now, that again results from people not understanding the new technology of how messenger RNA made COVID vaccine could not catch COVID from only a portion of the genes that made the spike protein. Now, Delta had an even greater transmission and virulence compared to the earlier variants. And once again, people who were not vaccinated had a greater likelihood of becoming infected, having serious illness, and dying from COVID-related illness than unvaccinated people. For example, these data show that an unvaccinated person was 13.9 times more likely to be infected compared to someone who had been vaccinated and boosted in October, November of 2021. Okay, they had a 53.2 times greater chance of death compared to someone who had been vaccinated and boosted in that same time period. If you compared them to people who were vaccinated but didn't have the boost, they were 4 times more likely to become infected and 12.7 times more likely to die. So I want to end with a cautionary tale to remind folks that we're not out of the woods yet with SARS-CoV-2 by a long shot. Now, the H1 influenza of 1917, which was misnamed the Spanish flu, was relatively benign compared to the 1918 variants. The 1917 variant tended to be more lethal to individuals at ages greater than 65 years. Now, that is similar to the way SARS-CoV-2 started out. And that's true because folks who are older tend to have much weaker immune systems. However, in 1918, the variants were more lethal. And this is a description. Those who were infected died very quickly, a day or even less after the first symptoms. However, most likely died of an overwhelming and massive invasion of the virus itself. The virus destroyed enough cells in the lung to block the exchange of oxygen. Now, if you look at the pattern of killing in the 1916 Madrid strain, you could see that most of the people who died were greater than 45 years old. Similarly, in the Paris strain in 1917, most of the people who died were greater than 45 years old. However, by the time the 1918 strain rolled around in Madrid, it was killing across all age categories from 15 up. And in fact, it killed more middle-aged people than it did old people. Now, that's the concern I have with SARS-CoV-2, in that most of the world is not vaccinated. And that means that the SARS-CoV-2 variant will continue to be transmitted, and therefore it will have continued opportunities to evolve. Now, if this doesn't concern you, these examples should, because the frequency at which new viruses are coming into the human species is dramatically increasing across the 21st century. For example, in 2014, Guinea, West Africa was the epicenter of the worst Ebola outbreak in history. But Ebola had evolved compared to the earlier forms, which pretty much killed an individual within 24 hours. The new forms of Ebola were less virulent and allowed people to survive long enough to get on an airplane and go somewhere in the world. 9 of these cases occurred in the USA, although this time around they were contained. Now, we have to be concerned that there are more dangerous viruses on the horizon. If I were going to rank SARS-CoV-2 on the same scale that I rank hurricanes, I would call this one a 3 pandemic, meaning it's really bad, but there are viruses out there that could be a whole lot worse. Now, we have to change the way we are living if we expect to survive. Now, a new and emerging virus is defined as one that has been recently identified as impacting human health. Most of these are zoonotic, meaning they cross the species barrier. Now, given the increasing frequency of these events, there's an urgent need to monitor new and emerging pathogens. However, in 2018, the Trump administration decided to eliminate a program that had started with the Obama administration designed to monitor new, emerging, dangerous viruses. In 2019, even as coronavirus was emerging as a pandemic, the Trump administration planned to shut down that agency. Now, they eventually backtracked and recognized that they needed to do that, and they provided emergency authorization to refund the program. But by then, COVID-19 was already a global pandemic. Now, the viruses are going to continue to evolve, and therefore we must change. The most serious threat to our future is actually industrialized livestock farming, growing vast genetically uniform stocks instead of more diverse populations that have the ability to stop a pandemic, only fosters the spread of more dangerous viruses. Increased herd size, greater density, select for pathogens with increased rates of transmission, and also the ability to recurrently infect these herds. It also allows for greater opportunity for genetic recombination across strains, one that might arise in ducks or chickens, and then combine with something that appears in pigs or cows. Okay, for example, we know that recombination could result in a virus with the transmissibility of the Omicron variant, but the virulence of the Delta variant. One example of this occurred in 2016 when France's Duke and Goose sectors were hit with 18 simultaneous outbreaks of the highly pathogenic influenza strains H5N1, H5N2, H5N3, and H5N9. So the take-home message here is that viruses and bacteria are always going to be with us, that they have the potential to evolve to be dangerous pathogens which can kill us, okay? And that therefore we must change the way we are living if we have any chance to survive the pandemics that are occurring and are brewing as I speak. I thank you for your attention, and if should you have any questions about my presentation, you can reach me at my email address at North Carolina A&T, gravesjl@ncat.edu. If you could not find that or you don't remember it, you can contact the hosts of this presentation who have my email address. Thank you all for your time, and I hope that you stay safe through this pandemic.
Thank you, Dr. Graves, for that interesting presentation. And again, we are sorry that we cannot take questions, but he did provide an email if you wish to ask a question of Dr. Graves. Our next presenters are going to turn to issues of economics. That is Desmond Drummer and Darrick Hamilton. Welcome.
Good morning. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. To President McCreary, Dean Tanner, Professor McLean-Farrell, and the entire team behind the 2022 Warren L. Dennis Metro Urban Lecture Series, thank you for your invitation to join this critical conversation. There is a real and palpable spirit of warmth and welcome in this place, and your hospitality has been exceptional. The Warren L. Dennis Lecture Series highlights the need in ministry for robust and rigorous engagement in the systems and structures that shape our urban realities. Professor Hamilton and I will be taking a dialogical approach to this segment of the lecture series. His remarks will be followed by a panel-style conversation between the two of us, after which we will open it up for the audience for continued dialogue, discussion, and engagement. Now, I suspect Professor Hamilton invited me to join him for this presentation, not only because of my professional work and our work in partnership together, but because of my academic background. While I studied economics in college at Morehouse College in Atlanta, the economics I learned in school didn't provide the answers I was looking for. The economics I learned in college didn't explain why my mother, who worked full-time, very hard, it didn't explain why she couldn't afford the medicine she needed to be well. The economics I learned in college didn't explain the hood, why the hood exists, and why is it characterized by the features of deprivation and scarcity. Why is there a West End of Atlanta? Why is the east side of San Antonio cut out from the prosperity in the broader city? And maybe more accurately, the explanations offered by the field of economics were simply inadequate. They blamed my mother for being unable to afford her medicine, not the system that creates and maintains low wages and keeps the cost of healthcare high. And so while I appreciated economics as a field and as a mode of analysis, I saw its severe limitations in examining the values and normative commitments encoded in the models and theorems of economists. So I abandoned economics and I pursued the study of religion and public life at the University of Chicago Divinity School to engage questions of morality and justice. And so without further ado, it is my honor to welcome to the podium the leading example of a prophetic witness in the field of economics, Professor Darrick Hamilton.
Thank you. One lesson for myself is to not let Damon go before me, to set up expectations and really deliver some powerful remarks. So thank you, President McCreary. Thank you, Dean Tanner. Thank you, Professor McLean-Farrell. And let me get into the remarks. Damon is correct that a myopic lens of our societal problems focusing on a particular normative perspective of economics is inadequate. That we need to recognize that the politics of our day, the ways in which identity groups are stratified and aligned, they're all inseparable from economics, and all three need to be understood in an iterative framework. And we're gonna have a keen eye towards remedy. We have dramatic problems. This pandemic has revealed them. But despair should not keep us away from justice. By April of 2020, 5 months into the pandemic, our official unemployment rate had reached 15%. That's the highest it had been since the Great Depression. Of course, we hibernated the economy, according to Paul Krugman, in order to preserve lives. So it was necessary. It is typically the case that the Black unemployment is generally and sadly, stylistically, twice the rate of white workers. But with this pandemic, by April of 2020, the Black unemployment rate had reached 17% and 14% for white worker. So as I mentioned, usually the rate for Black workers is twice as high as white, but as we progress through the pandemic, that racial pattern of 2 to 1 has reemerged. So this recession was different in that we abruptly halted work to preserve lives. Nevertheless, as we have relaxed social distancing rules, Blacks have generally been the last hired in that adage of first fired, last hired. The unemployment reports underestimate our economic toll, as well as our underemployment, being out of the labor force, loss of health insurance, and the mental and financial angst of unemployment and the pandemic more generally. This global pandemic reveals a collective public health and economic vulnerability of a system that has actively produced inequality, but in plain sight, race is still a focal point. And in an international context, as the previous speaker pointed out, we know that everybody doesn't have access in the same way because most of the world is still unvaccinated. Indeed, the biggest precondition of them all is wealth and resource itself. Many Americans, Black and brown families in particular, they have low wealth, inadequate health care, and work in precarious but essential jobs that have fewer workplace protections, lower wages, and lower benefits. Racism, sexism, and other isms are not simply irrational, bigoted prejudices, but long leveraged strategic mechanisms for exploitation and extraction that have benefited some at the expense of others. Wealthier families are better endowed to withstand financial hardship resulting from any number of emergencies, including a global pandemic. The immoral devaluation of Black lives has been ingrained in the American political economy, and it is long overdue for reckoning. This is unjust, and it's all about power relationships. At issue has been government's complicity in generating this economic and racial disparity. To reverse decades and generation of poverty, discrimination, and economic and political concentration at the top, we need a bold overhaul of our laws and our economy. Instead, what we have is the emergent political consensus driven by economists is based on a view that a proverbial market and marketized solutions are what is best for our economy and distributional sorting. That economic worldview is based on a dogma, a faith that markets are somehow natural, transparent, efficient, and inevitable. This belief does not give enough credence to the political actions that form and codify markets in the first place. To even do a farmer's market, one needs a permit. Instead, the presumption that markets are natural leads to a false notion of fairness that somehow, if each individual is free to pursue their own profit and happiness, that will ultimately lead to the greater good for society. My discipline, economics, is framed as a science. It presents an innuendo of purity devoid of politics, power, and tribalism that we have constantly seen across space and across time throughout human history. Regardless of one's ideology, from a Marxist perspective to a public choice perspective, economics, politics, and social stratification, as measured by class, race, gender, nativity, sexual orientation, they have never been separable. To be clear, though, I am not calling for an end of identity or affinity groupings, but rather an end to their importance as it relates to material outcomes. Understanding persistent and extreme inequality and the pivotal role that race and other group identities, such as gender, disability status, sexual orientation, how they forge political alignments and economic division, that should be core of the mission of an economist, the mission of a social scientist, the mission of a humanist, and society writ large. Personally, I'm not motivated to be a scholar solely because of my love of knowledge or knowledge creation. My objective is to produce knowledge with the explicit intent of building economic inclusion, civic engagement, and social equity. And what the Nobel laureate Amartya Sen has referred to as human capabilities, enabling people to define and attain their self-determined goals. We need to recognize that all scholarship is rooted in norms, especially scholarship that claims to study production, transactions, and distributions. We should embrace the principles of morality, decency, and economic sustainability in a vision and a plan to address inequality and political economy. Whether we have realized them or not, civil and political aspects of human rights, they're well ingrained in our public psyche. But at least as important is economic rights. Indeed, in the wake of World War II and the dismantling of a fascist Nazi regime, the United Nations General Assembly issued the landmark Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and what was included in that was economic rights. This was done in 1948. Human rights were described as universal and related to the maintenance of human dignity, and that nation states had a fiduciary responsibility to deliver those rights. The Commission identified 5 categories of human rights. They talked about civil rights, political rights, social rights, cultural rights, and what I'm emphasizing today, economic rights. That concept of economic rights also has deep roots in our civil rights history. The Reverend Martin Luther King, he pushed for guaranteed jobs and guaranteed income towards his final years. He said, quote, "I am now convinced that the simplest approach will prove to be the most effective. The solution to poverty is to abolish it directly by a now and widely discussed measure, the guaranteed income." What we do today, rather than empowering the poor, we manage them. We manage them as a surplus population. We engage in income maintenance rather than income mobility. We socially isolate them. We conscript them to our military. We incarcerate them en masse, and we implement policies aimed at controlling their reproduction, their fertility, and their family formation. Race, along with government social programs, they are scapegoated. They are scapegoated to fuel a neoliberal agenda. Poverty and inequality are attributed to deficiencies internal to the poor and blacks themselves. Stigmatization based on race and anti-blackness, they're strategically used as political fodder to implement harsh and punitive control on the underclass. Blacks have become the symbolism of undeserving welfare queens, deadbeat dads, and super predators by which we're able to define a surplus population. Our political economic framing based on rugged individualism and personal responsibility, it presents market allocations as the ideal solution to all of our problems. In this solution, we use words like freedom and choice as weaponized rhetorical devices intended to appeal to one's desire to have agency and desire not to be a victim. These presumptions, though, pay little attention to the roles of power, the roles of capital and initial endowment, and how power and capital can adjust to alter rules and structures of transactions and markets in order to privilege that power and capital in the first place. We know that wealthier families with financial advantage buy crucial additional advantages for their children, such as the ability to obtain a college degree without accruing the costly educational debt that comes along with it. Lack of wealth prevents many families from accessing this advantage, contributing to an ever-increasing distance between those born with and born without resources. That neoliberal framing of our economy that I've been describing, it naturalizes poverty and inequality by castigating it as the result of unproductive and deficient behavior. That is, subpar outcomes are seen as resulting from personal choices of individuals and communities. An inclusive economic rights frame will turn all of that on its head by locating poverty and inequality as resulting from where it actually results from, which is an absence of resources. That is, poverty and inequalities are the result of policy choices that deny people the resources they need to have meaningful lives. The frame calls for government to end poverty directly by placing resources in the hands of people as a right. Economists should do a better job of understanding the roles of power and capital in our political economy and be more focused on understanding and advocating for structures that truly lead to more equitable and fairer distribution. We're not atomistic agents floating in unfettered markets guided by a free will into fair and efficient allocation. Choice is limited for an individual who lacks basic resources such as a job with adequate income, shelter, food, and health care. In essence, without resources, individuals are largely restricted from benefiting from economic markets and instead are at the whims of charity or the exploitation of other agents that enter those transactions with greater resources. There is a baseline set of enabling goods and services that are critical for individual self-determination, and that without them, individuals have limited capacities to reap economic returns from their efforts or their ingenuity. Public intervention is needed to guarantee inclusive economic rights to counterbalance the accrued economic and racialized private power in which, in isolation, economic markets are incapable to redress. Governments need to directly compete with and crowd out inferior private options that do not ensure universal and quality health care, housing, schooling, financial services, access to capital, and free mobility throughout society without the psychological and physical threat of detention or bodily harm at the hands of a state-sanctioned terror because someone's identity is linked to a vulnerable or stigmatized group. Our current economic system is grounded in values of self-interest accumulation, which has left us vulnerable to greed and exploitation. Growth has become our explicit expression of economic well-being. In isolation, it fails to adequately capture the multiple dimensions of prosperity, including human capability, morality, sustainability, and civic engagement. We need economic policy that centers our environment and people both domestically and abroad. We need to learn from the failures of our past and implement this people-centered physical and human infrastructure packages. We need to do them on a permanent basis, and they should be, by design and implementation, intentionally anti-sexist, intentionally anti-racist. Such an approach would trend us towards dismantling the material consequences and social stigma associated with identity groupings like racism and sexism. So in closing, I have a call to arms. Commit to justice. Commit as a matter of faith simply because it is the right thing to do. We are all well equipped to fuse insights from multiple disciplines, multiple perspectives to improve our humanist, social, scientific, and political understandings of group-based stratification in local, national, and international contexts. Timeliness should not constrain us. We should be undeterred by what people think is possible or not possible in a here and now, and commit to shared prosperity. We should use our vast and highly subsidized resources to produce high quality and impactful work that generate innovative strategies, policies, and investments that break down restrictive hierarchies, that empower people and move society towards greater equity. In the end, it is our economy, it is our monetary system, and it is our government. Thank you.
So I guess you can give us a signal if you can hear us. Are these mics on now? Okay, great. So we're going to open up into this dialogue portion of this talk. We'll try to be mindful of time. And then I think at some point we'll open it up for audience questions. And I guess Dean will just give us the signal when we have some questions to address. And even if they come in earlier, we would love to just see what folks want to talk about. And I do want to encourage those participating in this series to really lean in. If you have questions about economics, we have Professor Hamilton here who can break things down with and for us. I want to revisit something that you know, the many things that you covered in the remarks. Let's start with the normative claims. You said all scholarship, all analysis is based on norms. Can you elaborate on that? I know one of your sustained critiques of how folks are moving in your discipline is that there are normative analyses and normative commitments that are masquerading as positive, objective observations. And so could you elaborate on that, and I'll respond.
And let me begin with how I ended. And I'm going to say somewhat tongue-in-cheek as a joke, because Damon is a good friend of mine, that we should break down restrictive hierarchies, and you should call me Darrick. Okay. So the substance of the question, all scholarship is based in norms. Perspective, the questions we ask, the frameworks that we begin with some experience, begin with some lived body of knowledge. So, and in earnest, this is some of the advantage when we talk about inclusion. We talk about inclusion not just for the justice of representative inclusion, so that, you know, you don't want the elite positions to be exclusive of one demographic. That's a problem. But what I think is even more substantial is that growing up in a certain neighborhood will give you a perspective to offer insights to address a problem that begins with that norm. So let me be clear. You know, I'm a scholar in the full sense. I believe in rigor. I know that if we're going to address these daunting questions, one should bring methodology and approaches that's grounded in some scientific framework. But at the outset, even the problems I choose to address, the frameworks that I bring are always grounded in a normative perspective. And what becomes politically, so why does this all matter? It matters in a political context if we're trying to move forward and challenge a status quo, challenge a conventional wisdom. If the other side is purported as fact, devoid of any type of values, that is a disingenuous hurdle to overcome. So that's the framework and the perspective.
I love this because there seems to be a devaluing of having some commitments, some ethical normative commitments and values, and bringing that to the table as if you can either have rigor or be explicit about your values. One thing I loved about the study of religion was that I considered it at times to be one of the most honest modes of scholarship. It is not atypical to see, am I right, Dean and Professor? Scholars of religion starting their book with their social location and their own relationship to the body of work that they're engaging and the field or subject area that they're giving some analysis on. And it gives you a sense of how they're coming at a problem. And you don't see that in other disciplines. And so what I love about this lecture series is that, yes, folks in ministry, people doing the necessary work of ministry, have to understand all these different modes of analysis to understand our urban reality. But I think we also bring to these other disciplines, I'm not in ministry, but I'm over here signifying like I'm.
You have a degree.
Right, so those of us who studied this stuff, we bring a mode of engagement and a clarity about our values to all of this rigorous analytical work that needs to be done. And so I think there's something to be said about that dialogue across disciplines and across professions.
And you know, I'll add a little bit to that and say that one problem we make from an analytical perspective and understanding contemporary phenomena is that we view it in an ahistoric manner. So a lot of what you've been describing, I'm not a historical scholar of theology, but I am aware that a lot of our curricular and scholarship began with a theological foundation. So if we look historically, we were at that place, and I know that you and I talk about some duality where clearly I am calling my brethren of economists to explicitly express and ground themselves in a more moral foundation, perhaps a more explicit theological foundation to pursue their work. But on the flip side, we could also think about those that are humanists, those that have a theological perspective where perhaps there's a moral responsibility for them to address contemporary problems from an analytical frame as well.
Love that. The analytical demand of the folks working in ministry or in the field of religion and frankly, even philosophy. I forgot who it was. One scholar was commenting that a lot of the public intellectuals of like the 90s and early 2000s, it was all from the humanities. And so we had critiques and claims and a witness, but we completely didn't have a grounds to understand the systems that we were critiquing. And going further to understanding how money flows and works in our society, understanding the role of Congress in setting the budget, the Federal Reserve System, right, in managing the flow of money and the creation and production of money. This matters, yes, in the context of urban ministry. There's another question that I wanted to raise as I unlock the iPad here.
And while you're doing it, one of the points is, something like the economy, the economy itself, it is not some predetermined attribute that we don't get to choose. So, your point about humanist perspective as providing social theory and helping define what it is we want as a society, well, that is true. We do get to choose. We get to work towards a society that we want. So it is not this thinghood that is just automatic. We actually have some ability to define how we want to measure value, what we want value to be, well beyond the metrics that we currently use, like growth or GDP per capita.
One of the aims of this Warren Dennis lecture series is to shift away, or at least challenge, these forms of ministry that are rooted in deficits and deficiencies. I know you mentioned these economic models and kind of frameworks and worldviews that either are premised on the deficiencies of Black people or poor people, or either premised or justified by some perceived deficiency. If you can elaborate on that and its implications.
Economics is almost a study of scarcity. Economics is trying to achieve objectives under some constraint. But one thing we need to recognize is the political rhetoric around what government can and cannot do. So government doesn't have unlimited power. I'll be disingenuous if I describe government in that way. However, government has a vast amount of power in dictating where resources can be invested and in facilitating productive capacities. If society is at its productive constraint, then additional government investments can lead to some other problems around inflation, for example, and that's a big thing that we can have a whole conversation on. And I'll preempt and give people a shout out. Look out for Damon next Tuesday as he testifies about inflation for Congress. But back to the point that we have at hand, government in their ways of directing resources to reach our productive capacity, again, has a great deal of efficacy, and our society is nowhere near our productive capacity. So there is this role of what we can do and what we should do.
And to break that down a bit, we talk about a sustainable kind of clean energy, clean air, clean water future. And the response to that is like, how are you going to pay for, regenerative agriculture? How are you going to pay for, everybody having electric cars and using renewable energy and shifting to all the good things that we want? How are you going to pay for universal health care? How are you going to pay for all the things that society wants and that the people in this country and around the world are demanding? And what I'm hearing from you is the horizon of possibility is beyond our material kind of constraints that we exist in now, i.e., you said we're nowhere near our productive capacity, so we actually can get more done in our society.
And we can choose what we want to get done. So we can do more and we get to define what it is that we want.
Right. One thing, you mentioned dogma in your talk, and I know we're in a seminary. There's an economic orthodoxy, and there's folks who are called heterodox economists, and I know that's a positional kind of relative characterization. But one thing that I mentioned in my introductory remarks that I abandoned the field of economics in undergrad and I was telling the professor, ran into to divinity school and ran into some problems there too. But began to see the tools that I was learning to analyze and study religion as being very relevant and helpful for understanding the field of economics and the history of economic thought. And so seeing an economic worldview as a belief system or as part of somebody's belief system, an economic worldview that is bordering on now dogma, where any statement of the idea that we aren't operating at our productive capacity, that we can have more federal investment in our economy to get things done, that we can decide what we do in our society, that flies in the face of our current economic dogma. So can you break some of that down as to, this idea of this dogmatic approach and this idea of there being an economic orthodoxy?
Nancy McLean, in her book, and I forget the name of it, Democracy in Change, she describes, again, part of what I was trying to frame, which is that scholarship is rooted in norms. So the field of economics is not devoid of politics. So, for example, having such high concentrations of power in our economy, for me, that's dysfunctional from an anti-democratic standpoint, that those with a great deal of power get to dictate what becomes the norms of particular disciplines and things like that. And I'd recommend to the audience to read Nancy McLean's book to look at the origins of how the discipline itself got to where it is. But that said, let me put on my economics hat a little bit, because perhaps we've crossed the line and beaten up on my profession a little too much.
I don't know.
The point I want to make is that it's grounded in values, and we should own our values. But for those that are aspiring to be an economist, we have some really good tools in the profession. We do a really good job of measuring things. We do a really good job of estimating things. So the statistical approaches to understanding social science, I dare say, is a valid, useful thing. In addition, the economics profession is careful in its scrutiny of what we can define as a causal relationship. So that said, I would encourage people to not turn off from economics, but recognize the value. But I'd also encourage our brethren to recognize that we get to state our values up front and clear, and if we don't, it's disingenuous.
We have a question.
We do. It comes from one of our alumni and a former board member. What can or should the role of faith communities and nonprofits, especially community-based and faith-based nonprofits, do in facilitating, organizing, articulating, and or advocating for this new economic analysis lens and policy development in their communities?
I think Professor McLean-Farrell has the answer. Listening to your 2019 lecture, you've got a partner, right? So I think it's connect with the folks who are doing that analysis, connect with the Darrick Hamiltons, connect with the policy links where I work, and learn from them, contribute your perspective to their analysis, and bring their analysis to your perspective. And I think that's how we can bring this much more rigorous, much more centered and committed framework, and make that the dominant mode of analysis and mode of engagement on economic policy or whatever else we would want to do. So I think you've got to partner, you've got to connect. And to be honest, what I appreciate about Darrick's scholarship is that he doesn't just write in the academic journals. We're going to post some stuff in the chat, hopefully, where you can find Darrick Hamilton's assessments in the press, in reports that are produced in partnership with nonprofits. And so I think partnership is critical. I think we need the prophetic economists as much as they need us, right? And that's a great question.
Yeah, I have a second question on if you could elaborate some more on the notion of growth as viewed by institutions and corporations as it impacts their economic decisions, i.e. wage and labor retention, benefits, labor hours, et cetera.
Yeah, and I'm going to say a little bit on the previous one quickly and then get to that one. And basically social movements. Get organized, develop common narratives, cooperate rather than competing across groups, and then enjoy it, fellowship. It's important to build trust to intentionally invest in fellowship. And then a question with regards to growth. Growth is an important measure, but not the only measure. Don't have that myopic view of value without considerations of distribution, without considerations of other ways that you want to measure well-being and value. What good is growth if, for example, a small segment is only able to capture it? What good is growth if we are physically or mentally anguished? There are multiple dimensions of well-being, and we can do a better job of disaggregating it across distribution so that we can have shared prosperity, and we can also do a better job of measuring and valuing other dimensions of what we view as human flourishing.
Thank you. This is actually my question, and it's a little bit of dreaming to help the church see something moving forward. How would, for example, our world change in our urban areas, Chicago, New York, those areas, how can you see that changing with a guaranteed income for everyone?
You want me to start? Guaranteed income, you know what? Poverty is a policy choice. Poverty is a political choice. Of course, if we abolish policy, I'm not in the camp to say that that it will benefit all of us. If we changed our value system to care more about shared prosperity, one could say it explicitly could benefit us all. But under the current paradigm, if we abolish poverty, some people are going to have to pay more for an Uber. Some people are going to have to pay more for some of the goods and services that they're currently able to purchase in more abundance at lower prices. But the blight of poverty will be gone. So something like guaranteed income, well, we can choose to literally end poverty. We could choose to, we have a tax, we have a structure by which to do it. So we have a paper on our website that can give more details. In the interest of getting more questions, I won't go into too much details, but I'll just be quick and say that the child tax credit is a nice start. The child tax credit is one way that the federal government can direct resources from our tax code in a way to help mitigate the blight of poverty. But we don't have to end there. It's not just children that are in poverty. We demonize certain demographics of our population. How about even that brute of a black man, and I was being facetious when I said brute, that is also poor. Nobody in society should be poor. Mm-hmm. And we can make a different choice with our tax structure well beyond revenue collection to direct resources in a way that, again, promote people to flourish. And that notion that offering people income will disincentivize them from work, well, in experiments and in demonstrations, actually we found the opposite, that having additional resources empowered people to engage in activities that they previously were inhibited from doing because they didn't have resources.
And they're buying things, which feeds the economy.
That's right, there's that aspect.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? I'm getting a lot of comments of loving it and saying how comprehensive it is. So if there's something the two of you would like to cover, we have about 10 more minutes.
The one question I have is, Darrick, the one question I have is around the idea you come back to again and again, both in your talk and in the conversation with Damon, this idea of flourishing. So in theological settings, flourishing is central to the way we conceive of things both in the classroom and churches. But can you talk a little bit more about flourishing in terms of the economics and how that, because for me, when you think about flourishing, this is an area where the rubber meets the road in people's lives, because you're talking dollars and cents and how they live on a daily basis. And so how are you conceiving or how are you conceptualizing this idea of flourishing?
it's somewhat vague, but the specifics are, it's a lot of it grounded in self-determination. Obviously, self-determination in a righteous way. We don't want people to have the self-determination capacities to exploit and extract from people. That's a problem. But I don't have the capacity to fully define what flourishing is for everyone else. But I'll say this from a value standpoint. And here is why I think that economics needs to be expanded both internally and externally of what we think about economics. I believe our most treasured and valuable resource is people themselves. So I define value in people being able to have the aesthetic as well as the facilitated capacities to do the things that they want to do. And my imagination is not strong enough to fully understand all that can be done. And then the final thing I'll add, Janice, is in terms of defining it in dollars and cents, Diane Stewart, who is a professor of religion, I guess I have this affinity towards professors of religion. She has a great book out called, I always get the title wrong and I feel bad about this. I think it's
Black Women, Black Love?
Say it again?
Oh, Black Women, Black Love?
Black Women, Black Love. She turns this narrative around about the roles that families play in generated economic well-being kind of on its head. She defines love as the outcome. So love is the value. And she points to again, I keep using the word facilitation, but to facilitate love, people need resources. We know that in marriages, if you're dealing with poverty, if you're dealing with economic insecurity, that strains on a marriage. That strains on your capacity to literally have love. So she frames Black women and Black love in her book and builds up the ways in which society has restricted Black families over time in that domain that should be essential to our human existence, love. So again, just to put a button on it, our notions of value have to go beyond dollar and cents, and that is economics. That's not economics. That's part of the human condition that we should be looking at.
Thank you.
We have another question about how you can see the church and all of our organizations helping close the gap in the wide disparity between home ownership among majority groups and minority groups.
I can give it a shot. So one, and I think that's a great question, and I would say, given the situation that we see in front of us, before we rush to solve this home ownership disparity that we experience in our society, we have to interrogate, why is it that one's home, if you own it, not paying a mortgage, but you actually own it, is upwards to 60, 70% of your household wealth, right? So I think this is why we have to be super clear about the problems that we're attempting to solve. There are benefits to home ownership, but we also have to bear in mind and ask ourselves, what does it say about our society that in one reading, a non-productive asset is the vast majority of your family's wealth. And let's be clear here, most folks who say they're a homeowner actually don't own their home. They still are paying the note, right? And so I think we got to really be clear about that. There's all these imaginaries that we have to pick apart. I think we, studies in religion, field of ministry, have the tools to really interrogate and say, okay, so what are we actually solving? But that's the comment.
And it's a non-liquid asset. I mean, you can't access it easily if you would need to,
Right.
without going into more debt.
Home ownership becomes a good example of the capacity of what government can do. Mm-hmm. Historically, prior to FHA loans, prior to the GI Bill, prior to structuring a mortgage market that allowed people to pay into a home over 30 years, and government assistance, literally giveaways, entitlements in terms of down payments, most Americans did not have access to wealth, Black or white. Now, the lessons from the New Deal were that government provided a mechanism by which Americans were able to generate wealth. And it was home ownership, but it didn't have to be home ownership, which is the point Damon's making, but it was a government investment in homes. But blacks were excluded. We know by design and implementation, blacks were not only excluded from many of the benefits with redlining, with restrictive covenants, with local discretion in terms of how the GI Bill could be implemented, with housing segregation, a whole host of restrictions that allowed a white asset-based community to develop and advance, but exclude black people. But not only were they did they not have access to the government benefits, but when they were able to amass fortune, they did not have the political codification to protect it. They were always exposed and left vulnerable to exploitive practices from the private sector as well. So really quick, the lesson is government had capacity. We can do it again, but we can do it in a way that's anti-racist, that's grounded in morality, that does not leave communities out because of their race.
Thank you. Do you have another question about the Green Deal? And the question is, with decreased dependence on fossil fuels, but with electric cars, a growing need for electricity, is nuclear power part of that conception of where we go from here to get rid of our dependence on fossil fuels?
Now, Damon was a co-founder of New Consensus, which is a group grounded in our sustainability and a Green New Deal. So I'm going to keep my mouth shut. But I wanted to set him up, obviously, with that.
And that's a tough question. So I'll answer it in this way. If you want to engage in controversy, talk about climate policy, right? So the best analysis that I've seen, and just sober, I'm not taking a position on this, and to be clear, the Green New Deal, right? I like saying a Green New Deal because that invites a conversation. The Green New Deal sounds like some definitive set of policies, and it's like it's all set and done. But it's a Green New Deal, and we the people will give ourselves a Green New Deal. So it's an ongoing conversation. And there are segments of the environmental justice and climate justice and environmental movements that disavow nuclear as a viable option. It may not be a form of energy and power production that creates emissions, but I don't think anybody can describe it as clean, right? There is nuclear waste, and that waste has to go somewhere, and we know where they put it, right? It's the same issue with gas, natural gas refineries, and it's the same cycles that we see. That said, the zero emissions feature of nuclear means that, is that going to be the first form of power that you're going to phase out? No. We have a lot of natural gas plants, a whole lot of coal plants still going that need to be wound down, shut down, ultimately banned, right? Banned like cocaine is banned, right? Like you can't grow cocaine, so how can you, anyway, people act like bans or so, anyway. So that's the larger perspective, but I think it comes down to, I do think, and from a person, this is not any organization's position, but I do think in the framework of an energy transition, I think nuclear being wound down, and not renewing, the charters for nuclear plants to operate is what's going to be happening in the future. Nuclear is a very touchy subject and a very touchy, everybody's on pins and needles because Russia has captured. The thing is this, there is no cheaper form of energy than wind and solar, and there's no guarantee of a consistent flow and supply of energy than batteries. So, that's the real answer. And so I think we should be moving very, very quickly to wind, solar, batteries, and obviously nuclear helps kind of ease that transition in a zero emissions way, but ultimately we have the technology to have truly clean energy as our sole form of power.
I believe
if that's clear. I know that might have been convoluted.
Yes, I believe it's this year or next year that Scotland is going to be entirely clean energy. They put up a lot of windmills, a lot of solar places, and I believe it's this year or next year that they are shutting down all of their fossil plants.
And when we talk about productive capacity, choosing the direction and saying, we will build that stuff and we're going to have great jobs, we're going to do it in sustainable ways. That's the type of decision making. And that's the kind of power that our government does have. And we have to push our government to go in that direction. And so, yeah.
All right. Any final comments?
I have a final question. I have a final question. So, Professor Graves, in his talk, really challenged us about that we need to change the way we live. And so from an economic standpoint, as it relates to COVID and urban communities, what would be the challenge you give to pastors who are serving congregations that have been in the midst of COVID, because many of them are Black and brown peoples, and their workers are essential workers. They didn't have the luxury of staying at home, dealing with all that came with COVID and continues to come with COVID. So what would the challenge be to that pastor?
Organize, create community to facilitate social movements. I mean, and there is a long history in recognizing that, again, there's a calling to do this, in my view, that would be part of the theology, to not only preach the sermon, but to advocate for a better way, a better life, and facilitate remedy.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's connect. There's no programmatic solution to this ultimately. And so it is about connecting with social movement and situating yourself in those formations and building power and aggregating together with folks similarly situated. That's the way out. And yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will take a brief break, about 5 minutes, and then we will return with our final speaker.
Thank you.
Our next presenter, Gihane Jérémie-Brink, will move on to issues of mental health in the COVID era. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Gihane Jérémie-Brink. It's pronounced Gihane Jérémie-Brink. My pronouns are she, her, hers. Currently, I am an assistant professor in the graduate program of clinical and counseling psychology at William Patterson University in New Jersey. I also serve as a co-principal investigator and director of the 5-year grant-funded well program housed here at New Brunswick Theological Seminary through the Lilly Endowment. My presentation today is titled Challenges and Liberative Approaches to Mental Health in the COVID Era. Today, I'm grateful for a chance to talk to you about COVID's impact on mental health in communities that are marginalized. Mental health is something that no one wants to talk about. We often ignore, evade, and even try to avoid talking about our own mental health. Too often in homes, communities, and churches, there are taboos and obstacles or even stigma about the subject of mental health. For many of us, the pandemic has forced this issue. National conversations can no longer avoid the ways communities of colors are disparately impacted and have always been overlooked or disadvantaged in terms of public health. And we are now facing prolonged effects of the pandemic. And the issues in our national and international discourse are now getting talked about in our own pulpits and at our own kitchen tables. To begin, I'd like to share with you a bit about who I am as a scholar and how my personal community's experiences are foundational to my work in the area of psychology and mental health. My talk will address how this pandemic exacerbated existing inequalities and how my work as a practitioner of liberation psychology considers resources and opportunities. Liberation psychology might help us reimagine partnerships between institutions of learning, churches and communities in ways that facilitate opportunities for social change, engagement, and empowerment. So, for a bit about who I am and why I do what I do, I identify as a Black woman, an East Coaster with Midwest sensibilities, a mentor, engaged community member, curious learner spouse, mother to little ones. I come from a family, I'm one of 5 kids, or a sister, and a friend to many. I am also the proud daughter of Haitian immigrants, both educators, and am deeply shaped by the Black Caribbean American experience. This is actually a photo of myself and my parents at my master's graduation of community counseling. You'll note that that person in the picture is well rested. I hold culture relevant convictions around the affirmation of Black life, relationships, and community. A common Haitian saying is tout moun c'est moun, which translates all people are people. This means that everyone, irrespective of color, class, or creed, deserves dignity. Other traditions and theory of the Black diaspora support this general commitment. Bell Hooks calls for a love ethic that presupposes that everyone has the right to be free, to live fully and well. This implies my collectivist culture orientation. My awareness of the challenges faced by Black and other marginalized communities, both born within this country and those who have migrated here, inspire me to practice, teach, and engage in scholarship that places an individual's development within a larger social-cultural context. I name all these identities because oftentimes we feel pressured to leave the other parts of ourselves behind in order to be or seem professional. I believe and embrace the notion that we can invite and bring all parts of ourselves, as our roles and relations inform the way we show up as scholars and practitioners. So as I show up in the fullness of who I am, I hope you'll be present and embrace which aligns and connects with you. I also encourage you to reflect on your own identities and how they are instrumental in how you will be engaging in this material and also sharing of this space. I believe it's important to draw context in which we work and live that recognizes a contextual social political reality that informs our understanding and our practice. Friends, we are meeting during a time of social political instability, 2 years into a global pandemic, a time of continued hostility and overt forms of violence by way of war, structural racism here and abroad, continued aggressive anti-immigrant policy and witnessing of inhumane treatment of Haitians and South American refugees at US borders, anti-gender affirming legislation, anti-critical race laws, where we see a coordinated effort to prevent progress towards diversity inclusion efforts that have taken well over the past 50 years, largely in K-12 schools, but now we're seeing that these efforts are moving towards higher education and encroaching on our professional roles as psychologists and mental health professionals. I believe that a social ecological model helps us to further the understanding of the ways in which a person and their mental health exists within a number of different but concentric social ecological factors. A social ecological model helps to illuminate the systems that impact our lives. So for example, when we experience oppression, oppression is not just something that happens out there or political or social societal forces, but also here. It directly impacts our sense of self, our interpersonal relationships, our families, and communities. It's bigger than just bias and goes beyond the Black-white racial narrative. It's systemic, it's apparent in systems of sexism, racism, heterosexism, ableism. It's maintained through power and privilege, and widens the disparities gap in education, criminal justice system, medical and mental health systems. So for practitioners, whether you're in clinical practice, research and education, or pastoral care, this approach has a lot to offer, not just for the well-being of the individual under the weight of being the target of oppression, but also across all of these oppressive systems that we have learned and have been socialized in. The problem of living in a pandemic threatens the mental health and well-being of all people. Howard Markle, a historian of medicine at the University of Michigan, who has studied other pandemics, has remarked that the most predictable thing about this coronavirus is its unpredictability. This destabilizing force cuts across racial and ethnic lines. It cuts across urban and rural divides. And it also cuts across our inability or lack of shared recognition and consensus around the common good to curtail the adverse public health impacts of this virus. However, We as a society have not experienced this instability at equivalent forces across categories of race, class, gender, and sexuality. So while rates of anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation are increasing for people of all races and ethnicities, there has been a disproportionate impact on folks of color and folks from communities that are marginalized. This data collected from the Mental Health America reports information from help-seeking populations, meaning these are people who are searching for mental health resources and supports online. So in examining the data of almost 600,000 people screened for mental health where race and ethnicity were reported, Black or African American screeners have had the highest average percent change over time for both anxiety and depression. Black screeners had the highest average percent changes over time for depression at 0.62%. And we also see here followed by Native American or American Indian screeners at 0.56%. and Latino screeners at 0.38%. And what we see here is from February to September 2020, the percentage of Black screeners scoring with symptoms of moderate to severe depression increased from 77 to 84%. We see the same trend for reports on anxiety among Black screeners. There was increase from 70 to 78%. The racial disparities evident in this data cannot help but bear out disparities in ways that BIPOC families, neighborhoods, faith communities, schools, and economic structures bear the brunt of these mental health inequities. The vast differences in the rates of occurrence of mental health symptoms will invariably put strain on all aspects of life in these populations. So, for example, secondary impacts of the pandemic, such as food, housing, economic insecurity, have had a disproportionate impact on BIPOC and low-income communities. Increasing disparities such as disparate rates of COVID-19 and its impact on mental health, lack of access to affordable and culturally relevant mental health services and resources, heightening the distrust in the healthcare systems, inequities of care. These in turn create larger impacts on the mental health of individuals within these communities. APA's 2022 Stress in America reports that 3 in 5 US adults say that protests following the death of George Floyd are a significant source of stress. Nearly 2/3 report that the government response to the protests is a significant source of stress. So I really want to highlight and point out, and even put into context the data regarding Black screeners having highest average percentage change over time for both anxiety and depression. It's important that we must acknowledge with what was going on at this time, the co-occurring pandemics of the health pandemic and the racism pandemic. The murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd sparked a wave of national and global protests calling for an end to police brutality and white supremacist violence during the summer of 2020. And so it's important to note that the co-occurrence of this health pandemic and the impact of racism is important in terms of how that impacts one's mental health and well-being. And even when we think about these co-occurring pandemics, George Floyd, someone who died not by COVID, which he tested positive for in April, but publicly murdered by police, this is reflective of the racialized violence in the US, reminding us the need to confront racial disparities in policing and police-citizen encounters, and highlighting the need to address racism as a public health issue. Folks, young people are struggling with their mental health. The loss of normal academic and social experiences that are important to their development were lost or something we had to regain over the course of these 2 years. And also for an estimated 167,000 youth known as the forgotten grievers have lost parents and caregivers to COVID. The stakes of untreated mental health and behavioral health symptoms for children and adolescents are exceptionally high and can have profound consequences on the trajectory of a child's life. The suicide rate in the US is the highest among wealthy nations and is now the second leading cause of death among 10 to 24-year-olds behind unintentional injuries. The number of youth ages 11 to 17 years old searching for help with their mental health continues to increase. In addition to the increasing rate of moderate to severe symptoms of anxiety and depression, the number and rate of people reporting frequent suicidal ideation has reached the highest level ever recorded over the 5 years in Mental Health America's screening population. So if you look at the green line here, which represents the year of 2020, you'll see that in September 2020, 37%, which was almost about 48,000 youth who were screened for depression, also indicated that they experienced suicidal ideation nearly every day of the previous 2 weeks. Rates of suicidal ideation are highest among youth, especially LGBTQ youth. So what we see here is from January to September 2020, almost about 28,000 LGBTQ identified youth report having thoughts of suicide or self-harm, more than half or nearly every day of the previous 2 weeks. This data from Mental Health America is reflective only of self-reported data, so we can safely assume that the numbers for youth in need of services and support is actually much higher than reported here. In addition, college students are struggling and their needs are more acute in a post-pandemic world. This is demonstrated from data gathered from 137 counseling centers. The Center for Collegiate Mental Health analyzed over 43,000 college students, their reports of distress and seeking of treatment, not only of those seeking services because of stress-related factors connected to COVID-19, but what we're seeing here is that the top reports of distress among college students is mental health, their sense of motivation, their isolation, and also academic stressors. Students who indicated that their mental health was negatively impacted by COVID consistently reported higher levels of mental health distress in all areas. You'll see here that these reports of higher levels of mental health distress was actually consistently higher than the previous year's national averages. And due to the toll of the pandemic that has, taken on the country's mental health, so many of our graduate students coming into counseling programs, psychology doctoral programs, or even, graduate level pastoral care and counseling programs, these students, they're motivated to pursue this career. They understand well the impact of what's going on in our world because this is what's been going on for them. However, they sometimes pursue this while overestimating their own sense of wellness. We have many students that are really struggling, and given how short and time-limited many graduate programs are, it can be hard to attend to and support students, help with potential competency struggles, and keep them progressing on a reasonable timeline. People are coping with the pandemic and face a variety of external stressors that have disrupted how we and they function under normal circumstances. One thing that I want to take some time to do is highlight the many ways in which that we are experiencing heightened levels of stress as a result of shifts in well-established routines, their shifts in relationships and relational expectations, and then also economic and employment concerns. As we think about financial concerns and crises, while the wealth gap widens, price gouging and corporate greed continues to run rampant, many have felt the sting of furlough and unemployment. The financial crisis we have experienced has disproportionately hit those who were already working in insecure employment, specifically in low-income industries, for example, such as hospitality, leisure, and retail and tourism. PTSD. A study of 5 Western countries, including the US, published in January, found that 13% of people reported symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, which was attributable to the fear of actual or potential contact with COVID, isolation due to stay-at-home orders, or the inability to return to a country of residence or other coronavirus-related factors. The research also found that anticipating a negative pandemic-related event was even more emotionally painful than experiencing one. Sleep. Due to broken routines, more screen time, increased alcohol consumption, and dissolving boundaries between work and personal life, this has contributed to a surge in documented sleep disruptions and disorders. In 2021, 2 in 3 Americans reported sleeping either more or less than desired. Also, couples have faced, as they're facing more stressful situations, disrupted routines that have served to mask problems, limited opportunities to seek other forms of social support or stimulation beyond their relationship. This has actually put a strain on many couples. The pandemic has also been known as a perfect storm for couples in many cases, and has also been a catalyst for relational constraints and for some, the dissolving of the relationship itself. Caretakers for children or caretakers for family members are burnt out. Caretakers are burnt out. Burnout is a state of physical and emotional exhaustion that involves a sense of reduced accomplishment and loss of personal identity. Living through a long-lasting public emergency is representative of the words of Vail Wright, a senior director of healthcare innovation for the American Psychological Association. She states, "We are just not meant to live under the level of tension for such prolonged periods of time." So what that ends up doing is it really wears on our coping abilities to the point where we aren't even able to regulate our own emotions well as we could before. So friends, I also ask you, have you experienced or are experiencing burnout? I know I have. I know too well the experience of managing physical symptoms of stress and deep fatigue, while both my spouse and I juggle demanding jobs, raising 3 little ones, managing remote learning with no relief or clear end point in sight. The constant stress, the constant uncertainty, pivoting, and disappointment has taken its toll and been exhausting. And given in our society the imbalanced domestic arrangements and disproportionate childcare responsibilities too often falling on women, this experience of burnout has led to many women having to make the difficult decision of leaving the workforce. Economist Alison Strager closely monitors women's employment to the population ratio, which last year slid below 50% for the first time since the 1980s. The concern about many women forced to leave the workforce has impact on the permanent damage that may be done to their careers, their ability to provide, and their sense of self. These pandemic-related stressors have contributed to the collective grief and trauma impacting our entire society. This collective grief and trauma will now become an indicator for future generations in preparing for potential threats and ways to navigate them. I believe that a liberation psychology approach and understanding is necessary to respond to these concerns. Given how I see myself as a scholar, I have strong affinity towards the public psychology for liberation model developed by Dr. Helen Neville and colleagues. And they state that this model directly addresses the anti-Blackness, racial oppression, and the myth of white supremacy that are embedded in society, often fed by psychological theories and research, and built uncritically into our training and discipline. This model also calls for psychological advancements to be created by, for, and with people most marginalized. So those that are, those that identify as women, BIPOC folks, immigrants, LGBTQ folks, and those that are poor. This model is applicable to multiple contexts in which we work: research and teaching, clinical practice, churches, and in larger community. Liberation psychology has its origins from liberation theology, God's preferential option for the poor, highlighting the important intersection of spirituality and psychology. Liberation psychology originated in Latin America by Jesuit priest and community psychologist Ignacio Martin Barro, whose approach centered on addressing the needs of those marginalized and impoverished. Liberation theology has expanded and embraced globally, I grew up to know liberation theology from Haitian liberation theology, from the Petit l'Église, which translates as Little Churches movement. This was a Catholic church movement which grew from weekly prayers, sharing and support, to mobilizing against the dictatorship regime of the 70s and the 80s. When speaking to the abuses and government corruption, Bishop François Gaillot, a leader of the Petit l'Église movement, stated, "We ask, what does God think about this? What are the distortions between the Word of God and reality? This is how we learn liberation theology, not just in the books from Latin America." And so it's important that we not only incorporate, but understand the importance of the intersection of spirituality and psychology, as it has many positive outcomes. This intersection provides holistic psychological and socioeconomic analysis to the role that faith has on emancipating impoverished and marginalized communities. Unfortunately, though, psychological research shows that mental health professionals and psychologists are less likely to endorse religiosity and spirituality. And what this does is it puts at risk the decentering of a person's lived experiences and their faith in designing and facilitating interventions for larger communities of faith who endorse religion. And these communities are mostly, people of color and women. So it's important that, spirituality and psychology incorporate, notions and understandings of faith, religiosity, and spirituality in the interventions, so that we have a better idea, or it's reflective in how many of the people that we work with understand themselves and the world around them. Liberation psychology, although in its origin did not fully respond to the marginalization of women and LGBTQ folks, it has now evolved to include inclusive forms such as Black feminist liberation psychology, womanist psychology, mujerista psychology, and LGBTQ liberation psychology. And so it's not just about surviving and coping, but it has a true foundation of empowering folks. The empowerments with a focus on healing and transformation. So it's not just helping folks shift their thinking or cognitions, but really about let us address the systemic issues. Let us transform the systems in which we live in. So moving from a place of resilience to resistance. And so therapy and therapeutic services and community services more broadly is essential in validating and attending to the person's experience of those who have been historically, culturally, and systemically disenfranchised. The purpose of liberation psychology is to enhance and optimize the mental health and other factors in people's lives. It prioritizes the experience of those living in the reality of oppression and marginalization. It acknowledges the systemic issues and factors that have direct or indirect impact on one's psychological well-being in the ways that interacts with our interpsychic factors. It attends and affirms to individual and intersectional identities and cultural strengths. So many of you might say, sure, yeah, this makes sense. I believe I'm doing this in my work, or I think I'm doing this in my work. Or you might say to yourself after thinking for a little bit, wait, am I actually including tenets of liberation psychology in my work? And so I want to bring to this conversation oftentimes the resistance or the challenges that are evident in terms of our embracing of liberation psychology. Oftentimes, we remain in our comfort zones, in allegiance to decontextualized training that we received. And what happens here, or what's at risk here, is the erasure or the silencing of the cultural context of the lived experiences of students that we teach, clients that we work with, and community members that we work alongside, possibly resulting in people feeling diminished. Our training, our practice, and even our leadership approach oftentimes engages in pervasive tropes of saving and rescuing people. And when we do that, we're engaging in the process of dehumanization and have a deficit-focused model which overlook the innate traits that people come with. We often get trapped in the cycle of our own guilt and shame, which then immobilizes us for action. and sometimes has us then moves and operate from a place of fragility, where then we start to try to dictate how other folks respond to oppressive structures. We might say things like, why don't we just wait for policy to change? Change is slow. Instead of supporting people's need to march, to boycott, to kneel, to petition, to speak out about these injustices. Or sometimes we think and believe that the naming and the addressing of the impact of systemic oppression is inappropriate in different spaces or even divisive. We've all seen this in classroom spaces. We've seen this on the national stage and even in our church communities. When actually the naming and bringing about awareness and processing of how we've all been impacted and partnering together to form solutions is actually needed for healing to take place. So friends, as I bring this up, I encourage you to even reflect on the ways that you've experienced this or also have been leading this resistance in many ways. Really acknowledge within yourself or even within your communities. What's this resistance or these challenges? What is that about for you? How have they manifested in yourself and your community? We've all been there before. This process requires enduring commitment, continual growing and learning, embracing the notions and tenets of liberation psychology. This work is lifelong practice and needs to be congruent with who we are and how we live our lives. And so as we're talking about liberation psychology and ways to take the tenets and really include them in the ways that we implement them in our practices, it's important that these implementation practices respond to the needs of people. Haitian liberation theologian says, when you see the cause, you can find the remedy. And as I bring up points of liberation psychotherapy, foundations in its work and practices, I want to provide some examples of how this can actually look within clinical interventions and also community approaches to care. A huge part of therapy and therapeutic approach is the problematization. But often that doesn't incorporate an interactive or even an adaptive approach to, case conceptualization, understanding of, clients and their problems, and even the interventions and practices that follow. Authentic liberation calls for us to engage in the process of humanization, where we consider the environment of our stressors and the ways that these stressors have impact on us, where we reorient counseling services and community practices by contextualizing it, where we attend to social political context in the clinical work. So I encourage you to ask questions of yourself. How do I understand the lived experiences in the systems of distress that this person that I'm working with? How do these stressors manifest? How do these stressors such as impact of poverty, food insecurity, gun violence, unemployment, how are these manifested in terms of stress factors that they experience? We can do this not only by calling and bringing awareness to these concerns, but also by the recovery of historical knowledge and wisdom, along with the naming of the stressors. It's important that within this liberative approach that we create spaces for hopeful resistance. So beyond the enhanced awareness, the confrontation of pain and struggle, it's important that we come with solutions and dream into collaborative action, which engages in community and contextual strengths. And it's important that we walk alongside and co-partner with others as we are part of the co-creation of solutions for healing and resolutions of issues within the therapy room and beyond. You'll see here that this report from Simmons Social Work talks about that groups, these are often, and these reported here are African American, Latinos, and Asian Americans. These groups reported feeling that they would have received better mental health treatment care if they were a different race or ethnicity. This is a problem within our system of training and care. We need more clinicians and pastoral care counselors that reflect the experiences of their clients. And when we don't provide space and training for these folks, this does a disservice to our profession more broadly, but then also to the clients that we serve. This understanding here is a reflective of a larger issue where diversity within the psychological workforce remains a challenge, where only about 6% of Hispanic and Latino persons make up the psychology workforce. And that's also 4% of those that identify as Black African American make up, are part of the diversity workforce, and 4% for Asians. And so in order for us to provide culturally and contextually relevant therapy, services, and resources, there needs to be a diversification within the psychology workforce where we're providing training, mentoring, and resources for our BIPOC students and students coming from other marginalized identities. I grew up knowing and believing that culture is medicine and a healing resources. So we didn't just inherit the trauma and wounds that were passed down intergenerationally, but we also inherited the wisdom and the cultural strengths. So in other words, the good got passed down. We also were inheriting the intergenerational family resilience practices where we receive cultural assets and remedies. And this hits upon my scholarship, which centers on Black cultural strengths. It utilizes quantitative methods to explore protective factors such as ethnic identity, belonging, coping, and racial and ethnic socializations as ways to harness our experience to facilitate empowerment for Black emergent adults, couples, families, and communities. Black parents engage in protective factors such as racial and ethnic socialization. These are explicit and implicit practices where parents transmit messages about preparation for bias, understanding one's background, historical knowledge and culture, but then also promoting positive racial identity development. And these are done, from very young ages in order to empower their children with messages and images of what it means to be who you are, but also empower them with knowledge and skills for that when they go out into the discriminatory world, they're able to have a good sense of self and self-concept. And so the work of racial and ethnic socialization, we're able to recover cultural wisdoms. We're able to embrace knowledge and historical understandings of resistance. But we're also in this work able to alter, internalize the effects of internalized oppression into transformation and empowerment. We see that over the years, the cultural transmission within Black families is steeped in a tradition of resistance to oppression. And we also see the ways in which it has expanded, it evolved over time. So this not only happens within the public sphere, but this also happens at home, where we engage in conversations at the dinner table, where we have conversations about the talk with our children, or even implicitly through the artwork and books and cultural experiences that our children are exposed to. So whether it's in therapeutic practices or church-based mental health services, that it's important that these services include strength-based approaches such as socialization matters and ways to transmit, messages of, personal and communal empowerment as approaches to providing context-specific interventions. We can do this work, as our churches should be sites of socialization practices, healing, and empowerment. This work is also reflective in a community organization initiative that I'm part of, which is called the Black Community Watch Line. This work stemmed from many of us community members, pastors, lawyers, professors, and community members, where we were just sick and tired of these experiences of racialized violence and wanted to do something about it. We were sick of just having, prayers and, candlelight vigils, but really wanted to put action towards responding to the concerns of our community members and its needs. This is an interdisciplinary group led by pastors where we provide free and confidential support line for Black folks who are experiencing any form of anti-Black racialized violence and bias. And so in the work that we do here, we bring the tenets of liberation theology, where we've partnered with other local churches, this seminary, and also other community and advocacy organizations. So this work is really significant as we are bridging the gap between science, practice, and faith-based advocacy. A strength-based approach which amplifies the stories and the lived experiences of people that we work with. It amplifies their lives, their virtues, and practices, is important and key to the work that we do. In other words, it's important that when we're working with folks that we highlight that we come with our own things. So this incorporates holistic care. It integrates body, spirit, practices, not just focusing on the mind, but the incorporation of spiritual and body practices. This also integrates creativity, us reclaiming spiritual gifts such as prophetic honoring, intuition, speaking truth, and also, liberatory narrative approach, which emerges from oral traditions of storytelling, where we tell our stories to invoke social change, and also the sharing of testimonies. We've all seen the ways that testimonies have shaped and have been central to church traditions, where we're able to recenter our experiences, we're able to share and process that experience and reveal challenges or injustices that we've occurred or experienced, but also share stories of the ways that God has been part of this liberatory practice of, helping us to be resilient or resist some of the systemic problems and difficulties taking place within our own lives. These stories and testimonies, they not only shape the community practices, but it's a gift to everyone else as they're able to learn from someone else's story, as they're able to be empowered to also voice their own concerns and embrace other practices where they're able to amplify their own stories of upliftment and empowerment. Another practice that is very important is self and community care. So beyond, personal prayer and devotions, practices such as journaling, poetry, affirmation, music, mindfulness practices, or meditation apps can also be very helpful for your own individual care for self. Also, community care is extremely important. And we've seen the ways that this has been impacted by our churches having to evolve and shift online. This has changed the ways that we have experienced community in church context. In 2010, I provided short-term trauma-informed crisis interventions and counseling and psychoeducation at Ben Armev's Hospital in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, for survivors of the 2010 Haitian earthquake. This work enhanced my global and cross-cultural competencies and research on resilience and resistance. And through this research, I learned a little bit more about the LACU system. And the LACU is basically translated as backyard. And so what this is it's in Haiti, it's like a cluster of homes where many Haitian families or community members have their houses clustered in a way that they share spaces amongst each other. And so this LACU system, it really is reflective of community care practices, which fosters interconnectedness and community reliance. And I've been honored to see the ways in which that this community reliance has been implemented and reflected in the work of the Well Grant Program. So when we think about faith leaders, it's important to think about, who cares for the shepherds? Who cares for those that are providing healing and support? Many of our pastors that are part of and participating in the Well Grant Program have carried the weight of the pandemic and are experiencing significant forms of secondary trauma. The Well program, it builds upon my extensive clinical and academic experience, providing research and programming and support for Black and Latinx pastors, promoting long-lasting, sustainable shift in practices in clergy members' mental, physical, and spiritual well-being. With my team, we have developed programming, invited experts to talk about subjects such as Howard Thurman's Inward Journey, contemplative prayer and practices, burnout and self-care practices, trauma and healing within the church and beyond. And then we've also invited our pastors and participants to engage in what is called a capstone project, where they're not only implementing what they've learned through the program, but they also implemented some form of a self-care strategy or practice within their own personal and professional lives. So, for example, we've had pastors talk about the ways in which they want to really focus and engage rest in their own practices. And so not only will they engage in practices of rest and self-care, but also they'll find ways to engage these notions and understandings of rest and self-care in their church community context, whether it's through, the liturgy that they're presented within worship, or maybe a group that engages in forms of retreat and rest and self-care within their community and pastoral context. I've been honored to hear the stories, to see the ways that this program has provided a safe place for pastors to not only share and let down their guard and their loads in terms of what they're experiencing, but also to hear the ways in which the ideas and the engagement with this program has been instrumental to them really providing a sense of rest and restoration, rejuvenation for their own sense of personal and professional ministry. A pastor openly shared about his challenges and encouraged his cohort members to engage in self-care. He stated that he learned the hard way the importance of rest. He shared that the summer of 2020, which was challenging for all of us, he suffered a brain stroke while doing ministry. He stated, "The Lord saved me. I was told by the neurologist that I was a miracle from God and that I needed to rest." Another pastor discussed that she was able to get a spiritual director and that this program really encouraged her to look for mental health counseling services for herself. She talked about going on individual retreats and needing to be still. She said this time away in retreat allowed for her to stop glorifying the hustle and listen to what God is saying to me. And in our time of reflection, she posed a question to all of us, stating, if we are here to serve, but we don't take care of ourselves, how can we actually serve those that we've been called to serve and share our ministry with? And lastly, another pastor stated that this program, the WELL program, allows her pastors to take time to take care of themselves. Initially, he believed that if he was taking care of himself, he was then not attending to or taking care of his congregation because the people needed him. He stated that taking care of yourself, he stated then that taking care of yourself, taking time for yourself and having someone to speak to is okay. This is part of the wellness of yourself. And this has been instrumental in terms of destigmatizing mental health, the seeking of mental health, not only in therapeutic services, but also through psychoeducation and community care. Friends, it's been a pleasure to share with you some of the perspectives regarding the impact of COVID on the mental health of historically marginalized communities. I hope that our time has not only named the challenges of our communities and the challenges that these communities face, but it encourages culturally and contextually relevant care and community empowerment. We have opportunities at this time to recognize the strengths of our collective identities and values found in our particular communities and social locations. Those of us who center and care for these communities have a daunting task before us. As psychologists and counselors, pastoral caregivers, faith and community leaders, we often feel the pressure of this challenge, holding in view both systemic challenges and personal struggles. But I wish to encourage you that this very effort, a liberatory, psycho-ecological approach whereby we can then frame our work as whole life affirming in ways that respond to people within their systems and challenges. Pastors should not feel alone in this task. And I also hope to promote within this framework an encouragement of self-care for pastors and those of us who care for the mental health of others. This is critical for fostering the wellness of our congregations and communities. Be affirmed that you are responding to the challenges that are unique, and be affirmed that you are responding to the challenges that are unique and difficult of this time of COVID. Use approaches that center and work for your community. Be guided by context-specific approaches. Access the resources available in connection with this lecture series and through the WELL program of MBTS. Continue to work with those whose work is guided by clinical research, but also who center matters of diversity and social justice. Also, let us find ways to broaden alliances in these tasks and link up more readily within and beyond the church with mental health service providers that might be partners in this work. Let us be encouraged that we in our communities have strengths and resources within us for liberation, well-being, and flourishing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We do have one question, and try to summarize it. And they're wondering if you think that other social and community service sectors would be better provided, led, and strategized by persons who can really connect with and perhaps embody the cultural and social circumstances of those in marginalized communities, and how does a social service organization go about doing that?
That's a great question. I think that yes, social services and organizations do have the tools for that. I think that 2020 and its racial reckoning, where a lot of communities and organizations are now investing in training, in education, and mentoring to essentially bring folks up to speed. Reminder, we've been working within a decontextualized approach where the things that we learned within our graduate program maybe 20, 30 years ago are no longer relevant or even helpful in terms of the present day cultural context in which we work with clients and community members. And so I think by doing the work of educating yourself, by doing the work of also hearing the concerns and needs of community members in which you serve, but then also implementing and investing in services, education, and training that really destigmatizes mental health in certain communities, that really brings a culturally relevant context of care and approaches and culturally relevant therapeutic practices, psychoeducation approaches and resources that center the experiences and the lives and the approaches of those that we work with can be helpful. And when we engage in those processes and practices, it's important that we don't judge the cultural practices that communities engage in healing. It's important that we learn. It's important that we see the ways in which the historical knowledge, the wisdom that they bring, and the practices that they bring speak to places of healing and transformation that may not be reflective of a Western approach, but are reflective and center the experiences of those that we work with. And so I think we're at a place where we're called to this work. We're called to approach this work differently through education, through training and mentoring.
And I think another question that's along the same lines is, how can church leaders restructure their own practices to be asset partners with counselors and psychologists that connect with folks the way you're discussing?
Absolutely. I think naming the systems of oppression that folks experience is important. So having an anti-oppression and anti-racist agenda in our churches is extremely important in terms of setting the tone or in terms of our understanding of the approach that we're going by. I think it's important that church leaders, oftentimes folks are looking to you for how to go about something. How do we engage in a certain context or text? How do we, seek, resources and services? And so by doing the work of destigmatizing, by doing the work of making sure that our churches are spaces where we can, bring awareness of mental health concerns, this will help folks feel like I can bring my whole self in this space. I can not only talk about the challenges that I experienced, but I can also receive some form of not only a good word on Sunday, but also extending to that support services and ways that I can connect to community partnerships and programs where I feel that my needs and my concerns are being met not only within the church space, but within the community broadly. Years ago, I had a partnership with the National Church Adopt a School initiative. And one of the things that was really instrumental about this church program and initiative was that it partnered local churches with their local school communities. And what we found there was that through this partnership, schools were able to identify some of the needs that were happening within, with their kids, but also within the family context within these communities. But then churches were able to use their resources to respond. So it was not just like, providing backpacks at the beginning of the school year, but it's also just, after school programming and services, mentorship services and programs and services such as workforce training and development of skills, but then also, meals and family support services that many of the families and children in the schools experience. So this was a great experience and a great opportunity to learn the ways in which churches can respond to the context of their local communities and have great impact.
And I also know that our former pastoral care professor was Dr. David Wanders. And he talked about the importance of knowing who's in your community.
Absolutely.
And who's available. He called it a ministry of introduction, that you can introduce families and persons to good counselors for them that will be a help to them.
Absolutely.
So,
and I think in my position, the identities that I hold also deconstruct some of those barriers. And so I really encourage pastors and faith leaders to really think about their own identities in the ways in which, not only might they deconstruct and dismantle oppressive structures from the pulpit, but also in terms of ways of connecting folks to services and connected folks to the things that are available within their communities to bring about psychological and mental health well-being.
One question I have. So you mentioned the woman, the disparity in terms of the changes to domestic roles for many people, especially women. So I guess it's twofold. It's some of the strategies you have used for yourself because you're in the mix as well. But even thinking about children, we've heard in the public discourse around children having disparate access to internet and web resources, the way it's put children back in terms of the lack of socialization and those kinds of things. What are some of the things parents can do with their kids as we move to this? Joe Graves would say it won't be a post-pandemic. We can't go back to the way things were, but we're still discovering what this new thing we're living into, this new normal. What are some of the strategies for parents with younger kids as they go forward, knowing that we will have to deal with the impact of COVID for many years to come?
Right. The great thing that our research shows us is that kids are resilient. Not only resilient in terms of brain plasticity, and their brains are constantly changing and they're able to adjust and adapt to their new challenges and environments, but also socially. And so I think it's really important, you as a parent, you are your child's greatest advocate. So understanding your child and their needs is one aspect, but then also understanding the messages that your child is receiving or the community context in which your child is embedded in. I think there's ways in which parents need to advocate more for their children, whether that's extended support services, whether that's advocating for their child in terms of what they're exposed to in terms of information and resources. So the ways in which we talk about certain subjects like mental health, or the ways that we engage in conversations like race, if we destigmatize those things from the get-go in our home and show that we have an open environment where we can explore these concerns, where if we're having some of these concerns, we can respond to them accordingly, and that we will partner together as parent and child in this endeavor. I think these are some of the ways that we can start having these conversations. I think one of the things too that you mentioned, having access to information and resources. We need to use these access to information and resources for the common good, for ways to help support us. And so there's a lot of resources that I actually provided for the science of seminaries in terms of links and resources around mental health, around what does psychology say about the pandemic or race-related stress factors, things like that, so that we feel a sense of agency in terms of not only having these conversations with our children, not only managing our own stressors and anxieties in terms of parenting and dealing with the trauma of this pandemic, but also in ways to guide them for ways to approach resisting, societal challenges, or ways of thinking about mental health is just part of our health and normative to who we are and how we understand ourselves. And so it's exciting in terms of finally we're in the national conversation. Finally, these concerns are not just things that we sometimes talk about, but that we're really incorporating into spaces that oftentimes historically weren't open spaces, churches, schools, even classrooms. And so I'm really encouraged the ways in which that we can partner and shape some of these conversations moving forward.
Thank you. I have another question, and this is very interesting. It asks, in your experience, what are effective ways to name the systems of oppression in policy and strategy spaces that were structured as charitable models that continue to emphasize the idea that, quote, we who have finance and connections, end quote, get to help them who lack? How do we address the disenfranchising structures in many churches and not-for-profits in this charity wheel?
Absolutely. Oftentimes, these organizations, or we as folks who hold power, influence, come into these places as these detached experts. And we think we know the answer. We are dictating the terms. We're not actually listening to those that are embedded within these communities. And to be frank, it doesn't seem like we're really interested to hear, but also to partner. And so if we are going to deconstruct how we do this work moving forward, you gotta center the experiences and elevate folks and their stories to be the central thing that we focus on. So that means, folks who are part of this community need to be empowered and to have power and influence in terms of dictating, partnering with different communities. I think just because you have finances and resources does not mean that you get to set or dictate the terms. If we are truly going to embed and incorporate a liberatory practice to all the things that we do, not only in the interpersonal relationships, but also in the social sphere, we need to then, respond by essentially taking away the power, or shifting and transforming the power to those, to the masses, essentially. And when we're doing that, we're able to not only hear the experiences, but also be co-creators in terms of some of those solutions. We've seen a lot of this being called within higher education, within psychology more broadly, where we're calling folks to, decontextualize and to dismantle the ways in which we've been training, the ways in which we've been teaching folks about, mental health, or about, how do we help, how do we partner with communities? But if we actually just do that, partner, listen, decenter ourselves, empower those empower those who are doing the work on the ground with resources, then we're able to actually be co-creators for some of these communal forms of care and healing.
Thank you. This is a more direct question in that line, and that is, are liberating lenses taking hold of social, health, and leadership disciplines, and what are ways to engage in liberationist training and strategizing among organizers and leaders currently engaging in community-based work?
Mm-hmm. I think we have to have a specific approach. So a lot of times, in our training, in the ways that we work, we're just like, oh, okay, the way I was trained or the way I understand this text, this can be easily transferred and, we can easily do the same task and practice within this different community. So we're not really understanding the cultural context. We're not really interested in understanding like the people and their needs. And so what happens here is that we're disengaged, we're disconnected, and just not relevant. And so if we engage in, liberatory approaches, it calls for us to center the experiences, center the lived realities of those who are most marginalized and those who are coming from disenfranchised backgrounds and experiences. So that is just like the one sentence tenet of liberation psychology and liberation theology. So that needs to just be the main thing that we center on in that work. And so in centering that understanding, we can then implement some practices that reflect that also.
This is what students have heard me call it, aggressive helping.
Yes.
I'm going to help you. Whether you want it or need it or not,
Yes.
I'm the one who's setting the terms.
Yep.
So I think the decentering is very helpful.
Decentering, absolutely.
The other thing that someone asked is this liberative psychology. He works a lot with recovering addicts. And can this be helpful in their process?
Absolutely. I like liberation psychology is for everyone. And so it doesn't just limit us based on issues around addiction. It really actually calls for us to embrace folks who have different challenges, different needs, and different systems of oppression that they belong to or are intersecting in. So definitely liberation psychology is reflective and includes that also.
Thank you. I think we don't have any other questions, so I will wrap up.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again for this time.
Thank you very much.
So, So thank you, everyone, for tuning in to the Warren Dennis Lecture for today. As I begin my remarks, I would like to express our thanks to our speakers, Dr. Joseph Graves Jr., Dr. Damon Drummer, Dr. Darrick Hamilton, and last but not least, Dr. Gihane Jérémie-Brink. This lecture series would not be possible without the support of AAAS, DOZER, Dialogue and Science, Ethics, and Religion, and specifically the Science for Seminaries grants that we've received. So in terms of next steps, the videos from today's speakers will be available on the NBTS website, and once the Science for Seminaries website is launched, that and the resources from the speakers will be there for you for additional engagements on the topics that were covered today. Just a summary, a brief, couple sentence summary from Dr. Graves. I think one of the things I heard from all three today was we cannot continue to live in the ways that we've lived up to this point. Dr. Graves, in reminding us that the bacteria and viruses are pervasive on our planet, and they're not going anywhere. And so for us as humans, we are animals as well, we need to be thinking very critically about what are the behaviors and practices we embody on a daily basis and how that impacts the environment, creation, and even these biological forms of life, viruses and bacteria. And so what he challenged us at the very end, he says, virus will always be with us, and they have the potential to kill us. So we must change the way we live if we are to survive the pandemics and the future. And in many ways, I think one of the things that COVID-19 really reinforced, despite the rhetorics that we will put in the public sphere about the wall and immigrants, we are living in a global community. And so what impacts one impacts all. And so the care we offer for ourselves cannot just be for us and for those like us, but it is a call to collective responsibility. for those who have and those who have not, because as COVID shows us, those who aren't vaccinated, as Dr. Graves says, there's the potential for more mutants, and once the mutations happen, it impacts everybody. So as we continue to engage with Dr. Graves' work, let us be mindful of who are the others? How do we engage with the others? And how do we live into this community that we're in? For Mr. Drummer and Dr. Hamilton, their dialogical approach really helped us to move from this kind of myopic lens of seeing our society or economics as inadequate, this kind of deficit model. And so it's how do we move towards, as in Dr. Hamilton's language, this flourishing, where we are partnering between different disciplines have to be brought into conversations with each other. So Damon was talking about how scholars of religion, and we saw it in Dr. Gihane Jérémie-Brink's talk, they center the social location where they are. Their identities inform the approaches that they bring to the table, and how that is brought into conversation with other disciplines to speak to the realities that govern our lives. It governs the communities. It governs the education our children receive or don't receive. It governs the unemployment that different groups experience. And so it's how do we consider those things, but also act on those things. Dr. Hamilton reminds us that the government, while it is not all powerful, it does have some power to dictate where resources are invested. And so if you're a student at NBTS in the Undoing Systems of Power and Privilege classes that we've talked about there's certain policies and procedures that have and structures that have and continue to make our urban communities the way they are. And so how can we as practitioners in those communities be aware of that history and that knowledge, but embody practices in social organizations and advocacy and partnerships to begin to undo those things? It reminds me of the phrase that Superman will not come. For some of our communities, Superman will not come. We are the change that we are looking for, and how do we embody that? Part of that embodiment means that we are engaging scholars like Dr. Hamilton and Drummer. We're engaging with the policies. We're becoming conversant in disciplines that take us outside of our wheelhouse, and recognizing that all of these policies, the policies shape the laws, and the laws shape our lives. And as we engage with these as communities of faith and in nonprofit organizations, we are better equipped to serve the people that we are called to serve. And finally, with Dr. Jérémie-Brink, being reminded of the impact that COVID has had, the impact now, and the impact it will continue to have. Yes, our children are resilient, but yes, and we are resilient people, but there is the need for self-care. There's the saying I say to my students, it's either you rest your body or your body will rest you. So we can be called and equipped and anointed and trained and educated for all of this work, but if we do not embody it in a way that cares for the ways in which we are enfleshed, this flesh and texture that we take on, the body breaks down, and the work that we are being called to do cannot be done. So I appreciate the reminders around self-care, the liberative psychology that she calls us to ground us in undoing the systems and the powers that exert oppression upon us, but recognizing that some of the tools for that that resistance lies in the cultures that our social identities are localized in. So I'm very thankful because sometimes our cultures are seen as things of trauma and deficit, and we don't see within the cultures that we were raised the very tools for liberation. And so it's how do we mine it and together as a collective begin to work for this social movement that will bring about change for all. An additional next step relates specifically to the Warren Dennis Lecture. So the lecture that this series is a part of is named after Dr. Dennis, who upon the occasion of his retirement from NBTS in 2015 was honored with a resolution from the Seminary Board of Trustees naming him Professor Emeritus of the seminary. He served as the Dirk Remind Professor of Metro Urban Ministry and the Director of the Doctoral Program at NBTS from 1992 to 2015. And in many ways, I find it an honor to be here as the person who serves in both of those roles currently. At the time of his retirement, there was the goal to endow a scholarship at $25,000 that would yield a $5,000 drawdown, so the scholarship would be given in Dr. Dennis' name. Currently, $11,500 has been raised. And so one of the practical next steps for those who are viewing this live and those who will view this later is support this scholarship fund, support the work of the Warren Dennis Lecture Series in bringing scholars and practitioners to the table so that we can begin to continue these conversations that speak to the realities of our lives, especially in Black and Brown communities in urban settings. Thank you for joining us today, and we pray God's blessings on the rest of your weekend.